You're about to hear a story that someone somewhere on this planet right now still carries in living memory, the day the world ended. Not from books, not from archaeology, from their grandmothers who heard it from theirs. Stretching back 10,000 years, civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that never traded, never communicated, never even knew the other existed, all tell the same story. The world ended. Not once, not in one place, not in one way. On every inhabited continent, in languages that share no common ancestor, human beings preserved a memory, a catastrophe so total it reshaped the surface of the earth. 4,000 years ago, on the banks of the Euphrates, Sumerian scribes pressed clay tablets with the story of a great flood. 7 days and 7 nights the waters rose. One man, warned by a god, sealed a vessel with pitch and rode out the deluge. When the waters receded, his vessel came to rest on a mountaintop. 1,000 miles away and centuries later, a nearly identical story appeared in the book of Genesis. 40 days and 40 nights, an ark, a mountaintop, a rainbow. But here's what nobody tells you about these stories. They don't stop at the Middle East. Travel 5,000 miles east to ancient India. The god Vishnu appears as a fish and warns a man named Manu a flood is coming. Build a boat. 9 days adrift on a world with no horizon. Cross the Mediterranean to Greece. Zeus unleashes a deluge. Only Deucalion and Pyrrha survive, floating in a wooden chest for 9 days before landing on Mount Parnassus. Journey to China. Emperor Yu the Great battles 13 years of catastrophic flooding that reshapes entire river systems. Walk into the Australian outback. Aboriginal elders there sing of a time when the sea swallowed the coast, songs that geologists have confirmed match coastlines submerged more than 10,000 years ago. The Aztecs remember it. The Maya, the Hopi, the Ojibwe, the Yoruba, the San people of southern Africa. Cultures on every inhabited continent. Different gods, different names, different languages, the same story. And it wasn't just water. Here's where the pattern becomes truly unsettling. The sun vanished. Norse mythology describes 3 winters without a single summer. Aztec tradition recalls an entire age of total blackness. Finnish legend says the sun and moon were stolen from the sky. Then came fire from above, a substance that fell from the sky and consumed everything it touched. Columns of light that turned rivers to steam, land that lay barren for years. Ancient texts from India describe events that feel eerily modern, written thousands of years before anyone understood what they were witnessing. Flood, darkness, fire, 3 catastrophes, every continent, every major civilization, the same memories, preserved independently for thousands of years. There are exactly 3 possible explanations. Coincidence, our shared nervous system generates the same symbols everywhere. Diffusion, the stories spread through ancient migration routes. Or memory, real global events, encoded in sacred narrative by cultures who knew that the most dangerous thing about catastrophe isn't the event itself, it's forgetting it happened. Tonight, we investigate all 3. We'll follow ancient texts and geological evidence across 12,000 years and 6 continents. We'll examine theories mainstream academia won't touch, and we'll weigh them honestly. And somewhere along the way, we'll meet the people who made sure these stories survived. People who are still carrying the warning today, not in museums, but in living song and ceremony. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. Someone in Tokyo at sunrise, someone in London just finishing lunch, someone in Sao Paulo watching the stars appear. All listening to the same story. Tonight, as you settle in, you're doing exactly what humans have done for 12,000 years, gathering to share the stories that matter. Over the next couple of hours, we'll trace these shared memories across 6 continents. We'll read original ancient texts that describe floods, darkness, and fire falling from the sky. We'll follow geologists into ice cores and crater fields, where microscopic diamonds hold a 12,000-year-old secret. We'll examine one of the most controversial ideas in modern archaeology. And we'll meet people who carry these warnings not in museums, but in living song and ceremony. So settle in, get comfortable. Let me take you back, way back, to a time before writing, before cities, before everything we call civilization, to the oldest story humanity has ever told. Every school child in the Western world knows the story of Noah. The ark, the dove, the rainbow, the orderly procession of animals marching 2 by 2 up the gangplank. It's one of the most recognizable narratives in human civilization. Here's what most people don't realize. Noah's story isn't the original. It isn't even close. Over 1,000 years before the book of Genesis was written, Sumerian scribes in what is now southern Iraq were pressing wet clay with a remarkably similar tale. It appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, widely considered one of the oldest works of literature on Earth, preserved on clay tablets that predate the Hebrew Bible by a millennium. In the Sumerian version, a man named Utnapishtim receives a divine warning. The gods have decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. Build a vessel, he's told. Seal it with pitch. Load it with the seeds of all living things, and the craftsmen who know how to rebuild. The rains begin. 6 days and 7 nights, the waters rise. Even the gods, watching from above, are frightened by the devastation they've unleashed. When the flood finally subsides, the vessel comes to rest on a mountain top. Utnapishtim sends out a dove. It returns. He sends a swallow. It returns. He sends a raven. It doesn't come back. The parallels with Genesis aren't subtle. They're structural. Divine warning. Chosen survivor. A sealed vessel. Total destruction. A mountaintop landing. Birds sent to test the waters. The renewal of life. 2 civilizations, separated by 1,000 years, preserving what appears to be the same story, in almost the same sequence. Now, skeptics will point out unfairly that both civilizations occupied Mesopotamia, a flood-prone region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Shared geography could produce shared mythology. That's a reasonable argument, but here's where the story gets much harder to explain. Travel roughly 5,000 miles east to the Indian subcontinent. In the Hindu tradition, in texts that developed entirely independently of Mesopotamian influence, the god Vishnu appears to a man named Manu in the form of a tiny fish. The fish grows enormous and delivers an urgent warning. A great deluge is approaching that will destroy all life. Build a boat. Fill it with the seeds of every living thing. Tie it to my horn. I will guide you through the darkness. Manu obeys. The flood comes. When the waters recede, Manu finds himself on a mountaintop. He performs a sacrifice. Life begins again. Divine warning. Chosen survivor. A vessel. Total destruction. A mountaintop. Renewal. Think about that for a moment. 2 cultures separated by thousands of miles. No shared language. No established trade routes at the time. These stories crystallized into their earliest forms. And yet they independently preserved what amounts to the same narrative architecture. Not just, there was a flood. The same detailed sequence. Warning, preparation, vessel, destruction, mountaintop. Rebirth. Cross the Mediterranean to Greece. The Titan Prometheus warns his son Deucalion that Zeus, disgusted by human wickedness, plans to unleash a catastrophic flood. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha build a wooden chest and seal themselves inside. For 9 days and 9 nights they drift on a world with no horizon. When the waters recede, they land on Mount Parnassus and face an empty, silent earth. The gods instruct them to throw stones over their shoulders. The stones become people. Humanity begins again from rock and grief and the stubborn refusal to let the story end. 3 civilizations, 3 continents, 3 independent literary traditions, the same story. Here's the thing about what both believers and skeptics tend to overlook. Believers want these narratives to prove a literal, simultaneous global flood. Skeptics want to dismiss them as universal mythology, the predictable product of river-dwelling civilizations prone to periodic flooding. Both positions miss something crucial. Local floods don't generate stories about the entire world ending. Local floods generate stories about local floods. People who experience a bad river season don't come away believing all of humanity was nearly erased. What we're looking at isn't just water destroyed things. It's an elaborate narrative architecture, repeated across cultures that had no mechanism for coordinating. The divine warning, the chosen survivor, the vessel, the total annihilation, the mountaintop, the repopulation. This isn't flood memory, this is extinction memory. And these stories weren't casual fireside tales. They were sacred texts, guarded by priesthoods, sung in ceremonies, carved into temple walls. The civilizations that carried them treated catastrophe memory not as entertainment, but as the most critical knowledge they possessed. And the evidence keeps growing. In 2015, a geologist named Patrick Nunn sat down with Aboriginal elders in Queensland, Australia. They had travelled hours to meet him, and they began to share their stories, songs about bays and coastlines and rivers that no longer exist, stories passed down through hundreds of generations, from grandmother to grandchild, in unbroken chains stretching back further than the pyramids. When Nunn compared their descriptions to his seafloor maps, he found something astonishing. The places they described specific bays, the shapes of coastlines, the positions of rivers were all underwater. They'd been submerged for more than 10,000 years. These weren't myths. They were geographic data, encoded in song, verified by modern geology. We'll return to that room in Queensland later tonight, because what happened there changes everything about how we understand the reach of human memory. But the flood stories? They were just the beginning. Now travel east across the Pacific to ancient China. In the earliest Chinese chronicles, a hero named Yu the Great inherits a world devastated by catastrophic flooding. His father, Gun, spent 9 years trying to dam the waters and failed. Yu takes a different approach. He dredges channels, redirects rivers, reshapes the very landscape of China over 13 years of relentless labour. 13 years. Think about that duration. This isn't a story about a bad rainy season. This is a memory of something that fundamentally altered the geography of an entire civilization. Now travel south, deep into the Australian continent, where the oldest continuous cultures on Earth have been keeping their stories for longer than anyone previously thought possible. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions don't just remember a flood. They remember specific coastlines, bays, inlets, river mouths, places that modern marine geology confirms were above water between 7,000 and 13,000 years ago. These aren't general stories about the sea rising. They're precise geographic descriptions of places that have been underwater since before the invention of writing, before the construction of the pyramids, before agriculture. Picture this for a moment. An elder sits by a fire under the southern stars and sings. The melody traces a coastline, the curve of a bay, the position of a reef, where a river met the sea. But that coastline no longer exists above water. It hasn't existed for 10,000 years. And yet the song remembers exactly where every landmark used to be. Here's what makes this particular pattern so difficult to dismiss. Geologist Patrick Nunn and linguist Nick Reed published their analysis in the peer-reviewed journal Australian Geographer in 2015. Their conclusion was extraordinary. Aboriginal oral traditions had preserved accurate sea level data for at least 7,000 years, and possibly more than 10,000. That's not mythology. That's a functioning information system that outperformed writing by millennia, crossed the Pacific to the Americas. The Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes region preserve a tradition of Nanabozo and a great flood that covers the world. The Aztec codices describe 4 previous ages, each ended by a different catastrophe, the 4th ending in a flood that turned humans into fish. The Maya Popol Vuh recounts a failed creation destroyed by water. Further south, the Inca remembered Viracocha, the creator god who sent a great flood to cleanse the earth. Now cross the Atlantic to Africa. The Yoruba people of West Africa preserve the story of Obatala and a great flood. In southern Africa, the San people tell of a time when the world was covered by water. Their unbroken cultural lineage stretches back tens of thousands of years. Voyage into the Pacific Islands. Throughout Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia, flood traditions describe ancestors who survived by climbing to the highest peaks or building vessels to ride out the rising waters. Here's where the statistical argument becomes almost impossible to ignore. We're not looking at 3 or 4 or even 10 similar stories, not neighbouring cultures who might have borrowed from each other. We're looking at hundreds of independent traditions from every inhabited continent, cultures separated by oceans and millennia, sharing not just the general theme of a flood, but the same narrative structure. Let me lay that structure out, because the repetition itself is the evidence. 1. A divine or supernatural warning that destruction is coming. 2. a chosen individual or family selected to survive. 3. A vessel ark, boat, chest, canoe, built to weather the catastrophe. 4. Total destruction of the existing world. 5. A landing on high ground, almost always a specific mountaintop. 6. The renewal of life and the repopulation of the earth. 6 elements, repeated independently across 6 continents, in cultures that had no mechanism for comparing notes. Now, some skeptics will argue diffusion, that the story spread through ancient migration and trade routes, and for some regional clusters, that's plausible. Mesopotamian traditions almost certainly influenced Hebrew ones. Mediterranean cultures shared shipping lanes and stories. But diffusion cannot explain Aboriginal Australian traditions that predate the very migration routes diffusion would require. It cannot explain why cultures that were genuinely isolated by oceans, by deserts, by tens of thousands of years of separation, independently arrived at the same 6-part narrative architecture. The probability of this pattern emerging through pure coincidence is, by any honest statistical assessment, vanishingly small. Something happened, something global, something that burned itself so deeply into human consciousness. 10,000 years of cultural evolution, language drift, religious transformation, and the rise and fall of entire civilizations couldn't erase it. And these stories weren't casual, they were sacred, guarded by elder councils and priesthoods, sung in ceremony, carved into stone, woven into the most protected layers of cultural identity. The civilizations that carried these memories preserved them the way you'd preserve a warning sign, at the edge of a cliff, because they believed the cliff was real. But here's what most researchers don't fully appreciate. The ancient world didn't just remember water, they remembered darkness. There's another pattern in the oldest stories, one that's even more difficult to explain than the flood. Here's the thing about the darkness stories that separates them from everything else in ancient mythology. When cultures remember floods, you can argue they're remembering local events, rivers overflowing, coastal flooding, ice dams breaking. When cultures remember fire from the sky, you can suggest volcanic eruptions or lightning storms. But when civilizations on opposite sides of the planet remember a time when the sun disappeared, when the sky went dark for months or years, there is no local explanation that works. Let's start in the north. In Norse mythology, the end of the world doesn't begin with destruction. It begins with cold. 3 winters arrive in succession without a single summer between them. Fimbulwinter, they called it the great winter that precedes Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Snow falls from every direction. The sun gives no warmth. The natural order dissolves. The world grows dark and cold and silent before the final catastrophe arrives. Imagine that for a moment, standing outside your shelter at what should be midday and seeing nothing but grey twilight. No sunrise, no sunset, just an endless, featureless cold. The land locked under ice, the stored grain running low, and no way to know if the sun will ever return. Travel south and east to ancient Egypt. In Egyptian cosmology, the sun god Ra sails his solar boat across the sky each day, battling the chaos serpent Apophis each night. But there are traditions of a time when Ra withdrew his light from the world. Crops failed. The Nile became unreliable. The darkness wasn't just physical, it was cosmic. The fundamental order of the universe had been disrupted. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. The Egyptians didn't treat sunrise as guaranteed. Their mythology suggests an awareness, possibly a memory, that the sun had failed before, that the cycle of day and night, which we take for granted, had once been interrupted. Cross the Atlantic to Mesoamerica. In Aztec cosmology, the current world is the 5th sun, meaning 4 previous worlds have already been created and destroyed. One of those ages ended in a catastrophic flood, but another ended in darkness. The Aztec records describe periods when the sun vanished entirely. Survivors sheltered in caves, waiting in total blackness for light that didn't come. Travel north to Finland. In the Kalevala, the Finnish national epic, compiled from oral traditions stretching back thousands of years, the sun and moon are literally taken from the sky. By the sorceress Louhi, the world plunges into total darkness. People struggle to survive without light, without warmth, without the rhythms that organized every aspect of their existence. In Chinese mythology, the pillars of heaven crack. The sky tilts. The goddess Nuwa must repair the heavens themselves, smelting stones of 5 colours to patch the sky. The description isn't metaphorical. It reads like an account of the atmosphere itself being damaged. Among the Cherokee, there are traditions of a long period of darkness. The Inuit of the far north tell of a time when the world went dark. The Hopi preserve memories of multiple world endings, including extended periods of darkness that preceded the destruction of entire ages. Different continents, different languages, different gods, the same memory. But here's what really gets me about the darkness stories. It's not the darkness itself, it's the details of survival. These accounts don't just say, "and then it was dark." They contain information that feels too specific for pure imagination. The old choosing to eat less, so the young could survive. Families huddling around fires that had to be kept burning constantly, not for warmth alone, but because the fire was the only light in a world where the sky had gone out. Communities rationing food supplies, not for days or weeks, but for seasons. Children being taught to navigate in total darkness by sound and memory alone. The Cherokee traditions describe how communities organized during the darkness, who would tend the fires, who would ration the stored food, how the young would be taught to recognize the sounds of the forest by ear alone, because sight had become useless. The Inuit traditions contain detailed protocols for surviving extended periods without sunlight knowledge that served them in the Arctic, but their elders insist it predates their migration to the far north by thousands of years. These aren't the kinds of details you invent. These are the kinds of details you remember. Here's the thing about catastrophe stories that people often miss. They're never just about destruction. Every single one of these darkness traditions, Norse, Egyptian, Aztec, Finnish, Chinese, Cherokee, Inuit, Hopi, includes one crucial element that separates memory from mythology: survival instructions. Not just the world went dark, but this is how we endured it. Not just the sun disappeared, but this is what our ancestors did to keep the fire burning. The darkness. Stories aren't horror stories. They're instruction manuals wrapped in sacred narrative, designed to teach future generations how to survive what their ancestors survived. Pause for a moment and think about what it takes to carry a story like this for 10,000 years. No writing, no hard drives, no cloud storage, just human voices, generation after generation, elder to child, repeating the same words in the same rhythm until the words themselves become as natural as breathing. That's not casual storytelling. That's an act of deliberate preservation. Someone, somewhere, decided this memory was too important to let die. These aren't the fingerprints of imagination. These are the fingerprints of people who actually lived through something. And they raise an uncomfortable question that we'll spend the rest of tonight investigating. If cultures on every continent remember the same flood, the same darkness with survival details too specific for imagination, and structural parallels too precise for coincidence, then what exactly happened? The geological record, as it turns out, has an answer. And it's one that mainstream science is only now beginning to take seriously. But if the Age of Darkness sounds disturbing, perhaps none of these shared memories resonates more powerfully than the third pattern. Fire, not from the ground, from the sky. In the book of Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah are consumed. The text describes brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The destruction is total. Nothing survives. The ground itself is rendered barren. Here's the thing about this particular story. Most people file it under divine punishment, a moral lesson. But strip away the theology. Look at the physical description. Fire from the sky, total destruction, ground rendered barren for years. That's not a campfire parable. That's a description of something that actually happened, whether the people who recorded it understood the mechanism or not. Now travel to ancient Greece. In the myth of Phaethon, the son of Helios borrows the sun chariot and loses control. The earth is set ablaze. Rivers turn to steam. Mountains crack open. Zeus is forced to intervene not to save humanity, but to prevent the entire planet from being consumed. Rivers turning to steam. Here's what makes that detail so striking. It's too specific to be random mythology. Nobody inventing a story from scratch includes rivers turned to steam as a narrative detail. That's an observation. Someone saw or was told about water evaporating under extreme heat, and they found the only language available to describe it. The gods lost control of the sun. Cross to Persia. In the Zoroastrian Bundahish, one of the oldest religious texts in human civilization, the world passes through cycles of creation and destruction. One of those destructions involves fire descending from the heavens, a cosmic conflagration that remakes the surface of the earth. Travel to Australia. Aboriginal traditions speak of fire falling from the stars, the celestial serpent, the same being credited with creating rivers and shaping the landscape, unleashes fire, as punishment or warning. The specifics vary between language groups, but the pattern remains. Fire comes from above, not from below. The Aztec cosmology describes the fourth sun, the fourth age of the world, as ending in a rain of fire. The Mayan Popol Vuh recounts a substance that fell from the sky and consumed everything it touched. Not flames spreading from a forest fire, not a volcanic eruption, something that descended from above and covered the land. And then there's the Mahabharata. The ancient Indian epic contains passages that have puzzled scholars for decades. Descriptions of weapons that produce columns of light so intense they turn sand to glass. Accounts of rivers that turn to steam. Land that lay barren for years. Descriptions that feel eerily modern, written thousands of years before humanity split the atom. Here's the thing about dismissing these texts. We can say they're metaphorical. We can say they're exaggerated. But every single one of them, from Persia to Australia to Mesoamerica to India independently, describes the same phenomenon. Fire arriving from the sky, destroying the landscape, leaving the earth transformed. Not fire spreading along the ground, not volcanic eruptions which are geographically localized. Fire that descends from above, uniformly, globally, in cultures that had no way of coordinating their descriptions. Flood, darkness, fire, 3 catastrophes, every continent. The same structural pattern preserved in sacred texts, ceremonial songs, and oral traditions stretching back thousands of years. And if you're listening to this right now, settling deeper into your pillow, feeling the warmth of your blankets, consider this. Every one of these stories exists because someone walked out of the aftermath. Someone looked at the sky that had rained fire, at the rivers that had turned to steam, at the land that lay silent and barren, and said to their children, "Remember this. Tell your children, never let anyone forget what happened here. The destruction was total, but the memory was stronger." So let's pause here for a moment. We've just travelled through 3 catastrophes remembered by every major civilization on Earth. Water that swallowed coastlines, darkness that stole the sun, fire that fell from the sky. It would be easy to focus on the destruction, easy to fixate on what was lost. But here's the thing about catastrophe stories, and this is something that will matter more and more as we go deeper tonight. They're never just about destruction. They exist because someone survived. Someone walked out of the darkness. Someone climbed above the flood. Someone watched the fire die out. And the first green shoots pushed through the ash. And that person turned to whoever was beside them, a child, an elder, a stranger who'd made it through, and said, "We need to remember this. Not for ourselves, for everyone who comes after." That instinct to preserve, to warn, to encode catastrophe into story so it can never be forgotten, that's the real mystery we're investigating tonight. Not what happened, but who made sure we'd know. And as it turns out, the geological record has something remarkable to say about that. The geological record doesn't lie. It can't. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't embellish for dramatic effect. It simply preserves what happened, layer by layer, millennium by millennium, in the chemistry of rock and ice and sediment. And roughly 12,800 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas. It was a period of sudden, severe climate reversal. The Earth had been warming steadily after the last ice age. Glaciers retreating, temperatures rising, ecosystems expanding. And then, within the span of a single decade, the warming stopped. Temperatures plummeted. Ice sheets that had been retreating surged forward again. The growing season vanished across much of the northern hemisphere. Here's what makes this so remarkable. Climate doesn't normally work this way. Natural warming trends operate on timescales of centuries and millennia. The Younger Dryas reversed thousands of years of gradual warming in less than 10 years. Imagine going from summer to ice age in less time than it takes a child to grow up. For decades, geologists debated what could have caused such a sudden reversal. The leading conventional explanation pointed to freshwater flooding into the Atlantic meltwater from retreating glaciers disrupting ocean circulation patterns. It's a solid hypothesis, well supported by marine sediment data. But in 2007, a team of researchers proposed something far more dramatic: the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. Their argument: roughly 12,800 years ago, fragments of a comet or asteroid struck the northern hemisphere ice sheets, triggering catastrophic effects that cascaded across the entire planet. The evidence they pointed to was specific and measurable. At a geological boundary layer dating to exactly this period, researchers found nanodiamonds, diamonds so small that 1 million of them could fit on the period at the end of this sentence. These microscopic diamonds form only under conditions of extraordinary pressure and heat, the kind of pressure you'd find at ground zero of a cosmic impact. At the same layer, they found shocked quartz mineral grains, deformed by pressures that don't occur naturally on Earth's surface. They found platinum anomalies, elevated concentrations of platinum, a metal rare on Earth but abundant in certain types of asteroids and comets. Finding platinum concentrated in a specific geological layer is like finding a bullet casing at a crime scene. It tells you something violent happened here at a very specific moment in time, and they found massive wildfire signatures, soot layers and charcoal deposits so extensive they suggest continental-scale fires. Fires burning simultaneously across vast stretches of North America, Europe, and the Middle East, all at the same geological boundary, all dating to the same narrow window of time. Here's the thing about what happens when you put these pieces together. If a comet or large meteorite fragmented before impact and struck the ice sheets covering North America, each fragment would have vaporized millions of tons of ice instantly. The resulting meltwater would have been catastrophic. In what is now the Pacific Northwest, geological evidence points to floods of almost incomprehensible scale. A glacial lake, roughly the size of Lake Ontario, appears to have released its entire volume in a matter of days. Not weeks, days. Water moving at 65 miles per hour, carrying boulders the size of houses, carving channels hundreds of feet deep, into solid basalt. The volume of water flowing through these channels was estimated at 10 times the combined flow of all rivers on Earth today. Imagine standing on the roof of a 40-story skyscraper. Now imagine the water rising from your feet to above the rooftop. Sea levels may have risen by as much as 400 feet in the millennia following the Younger Dryas onset. Not all at once, but in pulses that would have been devastating to any coastal community. Now, here's where intellectual honesty becomes important. The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis is supported by growing evidence from research teams at the University of South Carolina, the University of California, and institutions across Europe. The nanodiamonds, the platinum anomalies, the wildfire signatures, these findings have been replicated in laboratories around the world. But the hypothesis remains actively debated. Researchers at Sandia National Laboratories have proposed alternative explanations for some of the nanodiamond findings. Some geologists argue that the platinum anomalies could have volcanic origins. The freshwater disruption model still has strong advocates who point to extensive marine sediment data. Here's the thing about scientific debate: it doesn't weaken the evidence, it strengthens the process. The fact that researchers are arguing passionately about what happened 12,800 years ago means the evidence is significant enough to argue about. Nobody debates irrelevant data. What's not debated is the event itself. Something dramatic happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. The climate reversed catastrophically. Continental-scale fires burned. Sea levels rose. And every ancient culture we've examined tonight preserved the memory of global catastrophe, flood, darkness, fire dating to roughly this same period. The geological evidence doesn't tell us which interpretation is correct, but it tells us, with absolute certainty, that the ancient stories are describing something real. So now, we arrive at one of the most controversial ideas in modern archaeology. And I want to be careful here not to tell you what to believe, but to walk through the evidence honestly and let you draw your own conclusions. If the Younger Dryas event was as catastrophic as the geological evidence suggests, continental-scale floods, fires, sudden climate reversal, potentially hundreds of feet of sea level rise over subsequent millennia, then we need to ask an uncomfortable question. What was already here? The conventional timeline of human civilization begins roughly 6,000 years ago. The earliest cities in Mesopotamia. Before that, according to standard archaeology, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, intelligent and resourceful, but without permanent settlements, monumental architecture, or complex social organization. But there's a problem with that timeline. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found there changed the conversation permanently. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone pillars, some weighing over 20 tons, intricately carved with animal reliefs. Foxes, cranes, scorpions, lions. The pillars are arranged in circles, with T-shaped central pillars reaching 16 feet tall. Radiocarbon dating places the site at roughly 11,500 to 12,000 years old. Here's why that matters. Göbekli Tepe predates pottery. It predates agriculture. It predates every known permanent settlement. According to the conventional timeline, the people who built this site were hunter-gatherers who hadn't yet figured out how to grow wheat, and yet they quarried, transported, and erected 20-ton carved stone pillars with precision and artistic sophistication. Researchers at the German Archaeological Institute, who led the primary excavation, have argued that Göbekli Tepe represents a ritual or ceremonial centre built by organised groups of hunter-gatherers, demonstrating that complex social organisation preceded agriculture, rather than following it. This interpretation is well supported and increasingly accepted by mainstream archaeology. But other researchers have pushed the question further. If hunter-gatherers could organise the construction of Göbekli Tepe, what else might they have been capable of? What might have existed before and been erased by the catastrophic events of the Younger Dryas? Consider the Sphinx. In the 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University examined the erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx of Giza. He argued that the weathering was consistent with thousands of years of rainfall that hadn't occurred in the Sahara since roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. If correct, this would place the Sphinx's construction thousands of years earlier than the conventional date. Most Egyptologists disagree. They point to the architectural context, the quarry marks, and the dating of surrounding structures as evidence that the Sphinx was carved during the reign of Khafre, around 2,500 BCE. The water erosion hypothesis, while provocative, remains a minority position among experts. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, divers in 1987 discovered what appeared to be stepped terraces and geometric platforms on the seafloor. Some researchers have argued these are remnants of a human-made structure submerged by post-glacial sea level rise. However, many geologists, including researchers at the University of Tokyo, consider the formations to be natural, created by the fracturing patterns typical of the local sandstone. In the Gulf of Kambat, off the western coast of India, sonar surveys have revealed what appear to be rectilinear patterns on the seafloor. The findings remain preliminary and are still being investigated. Here's what makes this debate so fascinating and so difficult. We know, with certainty, that sea levels have risen dramatically since the end of the last ice age. Coastlines that were above water 12,000 years ago are now submerged by hundreds of feet. If any coastal civilizations existed before the Younger Dryas, their remains would be underwater, and we have proof that the ocean does erase history. Pavlopetri, off the coast of Greece, is a fully confirmed Bronze Age city now submerged in shallow water. Atlit Yam, off the coast of Israel, preserves a Neolithic village complete with a stone well underwater for 8,000 years. These aren't speculative. They're photographed, mapped and studied. So we know the ocean can hide human settlements. We know sea levels rose catastrophically. And we know that at least one site, Göbekli Tepe, demonstrates a level of organization and sophistication that predates everything we thought we knew about early civilization. Keeping an open mind doesn't mean believing every hypothesis. It means following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it's inconvenient. And right now, the evidence leads to a genuinely unsettling possibility. What we think of as the beginning of civilization, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, might not be the beginning at all. It might be the beginning of recovery. And if that's true, then the ancient catastrophe stories we've been examining tonight take on an entirely different significance. They're not primitive mythology. They may be the only surviving record of what came before. Imagine standing outside, 10,000 years ago. No light pollution, no cities, no highways, no glow on the horizon. Just you and the sky. The cool night air settles on your skin. Somewhere behind you, insects hum in a steady rhythm. The warmth of a fire at your back. The sound of someone breathing softly beside you. And above a sky you've never truly seen. Not in your modern life. Because 10,000 years ago, the night sky wasn't a scattering of faint stars glimpsed between buildings. It was a cathedral. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, so dense and so bright it cast faint shadows on the ground. Every constellation blazed. Every planet glowed. And occasionally, rarely, but unforgettably, something moved across that sky that wasn't a star. Something luminous. Something vast. Something with a tail that stretched from horizon to horizon. Forget everything you think you know about dragons and serpents. Because when you understand what the ancient sky actually looked like, and what occasionally crossed it, the mythology of cosmic serpents stops being mythology. It starts being observation. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was one of the most important deities in Aztec and Mayan cosmology. Quetzalcoatl was associated with Venus, with the cycles of world ages, with creation and destruction. A celestial being, luminous and terrifying, who marked the boundaries between one age of the world and the next. Half a world away, in Norse mythology, Jörmungandr the Midgard serpent encircles the entire earth, holding its own tail in its mouth. When Jörmungandr releases its tail, Ragnarok begins. The end of the world. A cosmic serpent whose movement in the sky signals total destruction. Travel down the Nile to ancient Egypt. Apophis, the great chaos serpent, attacks the sun god Ra's solar boat every single night as it travels through the underworld. If Apophis wins, the sun doesn't rise. Here's the thing about that mythology. It means the ancient Egyptians conceptualized sunrise not as an automatic event, but as a nightly battle that could be lost. The sun's return was never guaranteed. It had to be fought for. Cross into China, where dragons were not the fire-breathing monsters of European fairy tales. Chinese dragons controlled rain, storms, rivers, and eclipses. They were celestial beings whose movements governed the rhythms of nature. When a dragon moved across the sky, the world changed. Journey to Australia, where the rainbow serpent, one of the most enduring figures in Aboriginal mythology, is credited with creating rivers, shaping valleys, and controlling water. But the rainbow serpent also punishes. When the serpent rises, floods come. Landscapes are remade. The rainbow serpent is simultaneously creator and destroyer, and it lives in the sky. Now cross to India, where Shesha, also called Ananta, meaning infinite, is a cosmic serpent so vast that it supports the weight of all the worlds on its countless hoods. Vishnu rests on Shesha's coils in the cosmic ocean between cycles of creation and destruction. When Shesha moves, reality itself trembles. 6 continents, 6 completely independent mythological traditions. Every single one of them places a serpent in the sky. Every single one of them connects that serpent to cosmic scale events. Creation, destruction, world ages, catastrophe. Why serpents? Here's the thing about what a comet looks like to the naked eye. Not a modern diagram, not a photograph from a space telescope. What it actually looks like when you're standing in a field 10,000 years ago, looking up at a sky with no light pollution. A bright comet has a luminous head and a tail that can stretch tens of millions of miles. From the ground, that tail arcs across the sky in a sinuous, flowing curve that shifts night by night. It glows. It moves. It's enormous. And it's shaped unmistakably, undeniably like a serpent. Calling it a serpent doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels almost inevitable. And if a comet, or fragments of a comet were responsible for the Younger Dryas event, then the pattern closes with an eerie elegance. Cultures around the world remembered fire falling from the sky. They remembered the world being destroyed by water, darkness, and flame. And they remembered a luminous serpent in the heavens that marked the boundary between one world age and the next. They weren't making it up. They were describing what they saw in the only language available to them. The feathered serpent, the world serpent, the chaos serpent, the dragon, the rainbow serpent, the infinite serpent supporting reality itself. Different names, different languages, different cosmologies, the same sky. And somewhere in the ancient memory, encoded in stone carvings and temple walls and songs passed from grandmother to grandchild, the warning persists. Something moved in the sky. And when it did, the world changed forever. If you listen carefully to the oldest stories humans tell, you notice something strange. Something most modern minds instinctively resist. Time doesn't move forward. For virtually every ancient civilization that preserved catastrophe memory, time wasn't a straight line marching from past to future. It was a circle. Or more precisely, circles within circles. Vast wheels turning inside vaster wheels. Each revolution marking the death of one world and the birth of the next. Here's the thing about cyclical time. We tend to dismiss it as primitive thinking, a failure to grasp the concept of progress. But what if it wasn't a failure at all? What if it was the most sophisticated conclusion available to people who had watched the world end and begin again? The Maya developed the most precise calendar system in the ancient world. Their long count calendar tracks cycles spanning thousands of years, each great cycle lasting approximately 5,125 years. Like gears in some invisible cosmic machine, these cycles mesh with smaller ones, the Hab, the Tzolk'in. Together, they create a system of interlocking timeframes, so complex that modern mathematicians still debate its full implications. The Maya didn't just count days, they counted ages. And each age, each world ended in catastrophe. The current world, in Mayan cosmology, is the fourth creation. The three before it were destroyed. Specifically destroyed, not vaguely ended, destroyed by flood, by fire, by wind. Travel east to India. The Hindu concept of the yugas describes cosmic time on a scale that dwarfs every other system. 4 ages Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali cycle through periods spanning millions of years. Each yuga is shorter and more degraded than the last. Each cycle ends in dissolution. The universe is destroyed and recreated, over and over, across timescales so vast they make geological time feel modest. Here's what makes the Hindu system so striking. It doesn't treat the current age as special. It doesn't treat human civilization as the culmination of anything. We are, in this framework, living in the Kali Yuga, the shortest, darkest, most corrupt of the 4 ages. And this age, too, will end. Now cross the Mediterranean to ancient Greece. The poet Hesiod, writing roughly 2,700 years ago, described 5 ages of humanity. The Golden Age perfect, peaceful, close to the gods. The Silver Age less noble, more forgetful. The Bronze Age warlike and powerful. The Age of Heroes, a brief shining interlude. And finally, the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, which he described as an era of toil, injustice, and decline. 5 ages, each worse than the last. The trajectory isn't progress, it's decay. Here's the thing about what connects all 3 systems. The Maya, the Hindus, and the Greeks arrived at the same fundamental conclusion independently. The world has ended before, multiple times, and it will end again. The only question is when. Travel to the American Southwest. The Hopi people of northern Arizona preserve one of the most detailed cyclical cosmologies in the world. According to Hopi tradition, the present world is the 4th world. The first world was destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by flood. Each destruction was preceded by the same pattern. Humanity forgot its original instructions, lost its connection to the sacred, and the world was cleansed so that life could begin again. The Aztec cosmology describes 5 suns, 5 ages, each ruled by a different deity, each ending in a different catastrophe. The first sun ended when jaguars consumed humanity. The second ended in hurricanes. the third in a rain of fire, the fourth in flood. The fifth, the current age, will end in earthquakes. Different gods, different continents, different languages, the same structure, the same conviction that time moves in circles. That destruction is cyclical, and that the current world is not the first. Here's what really gets me about these systems. They weren't casual beliefs. The Maya built stone observatories and tracked planetary movements with naked-eye precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. They needed to know exactly where they were in the cycle, because the cycle determined everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare, when to pray. Imagine standing on top of a Mayan pyramid at night. The stone is cool beneath your feet. The jungle stretches out below in every direction, vast and dark and alive with the sound of insects. A warm breeze carries the scent of copal incense from the ceremonies below. Above you, and this is the part that's hard for modern minds to grasp, the sky is absolutely overwhelming. No light pollution, no glow on the horizon, just stars, thousands of them. The Milky Way isn't a faint smudge, it's a river of light pouring across the entire vault of heaven. And you're watching, carefully, methodically, tracking Venus as it traces its path through the constellations, recording its position against stone markers your grandfather placed decades ago, because you know your teachers taught you, and their teachers taught them, that the heavens move in cycles, that the last world ended when the cycle turned, and that the current world has an expiration date written in starlight. You breathe slowly. The torch beside you flickers. Below, in the plaza, someone is singing a low, rhythmic chant that your great-grandmother also knew. The melody hasn't changed in centuries. It won't change for centuries more. Because the song isn't entertainment, it's data. Here's the thing about obsessive sky tracking. We tend to explain it as curiosity, the natural human desire to understand the cosmos. And that's partly true. But these cultures weren't tracking the sky out of idle wonder. They were tracking it because they believed, with the same conviction that you believe the sun will rise tomorrow, that the sky had destroyed the world before, and would do it again. Cyclical time wasn't philosophy. It was survival intelligence, an early warning system, encoded in cosmology, maintained across hundreds of generations, designed to ensure that when the sky turned hostile again, someone would be watching, someone would know, and someone, it turns out, still does. The strange thing about world-ending stories is that they rarely end with everyone dying. Someone always survives, and that survivor almost never runs. They do something far more remarkable. They turn around, face the ruins, and start remembering, deliberately, systematically, as if the most important thing they could possibly do, more important than finding food, more important than building shelter, was this: making sure no one would ever forget what happened. Here's the thing about this instinct. We take it for granted. Of course people tell stories about catastrophes. What else would they do? But think about it from a survival perspective. In the immediate aftermath of a global catastrophe, floods, darkness, fire, every calorie matters, every hour of labor matters, and these people chose to spend their most precious resource time encoding detailed accounts of what happened into songs, ceremonies, and sacred narratives, designed to survive for thousands of years. That's not casual storytelling, that's engineering. Remember the geologist we met earlier tonight? Patrick Nunn, at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. In 2015, Nunn and linguist Nick Reed travelled to communities across the Australian coast to meet with Aboriginal elders. The elders had agreed to share their stories, songs about places that no longer existed above water, bays and coastlines and river mouths that had been submerged for 10,000 years. Picture the scene. A university office, maps spread across a wide table, morning light coming through the windows, and an elder begins to sing. The melody is ancient, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than every written text in human civilization. It traces the curve of a bay that hasn't existed for 100 centuries. It names landmarks: a reef here, a river mouth there, a rocky outcrop where fresh water once emerged from the earth. Every detail, every landmark, encoded in melody and rhythm, passed down through hundreds of generations from grandmother to grandchild in an unbroken chain stretching back to the end of the last ice age. When none overlaid their descriptions onto his seafloor maps, the match was extraordinary. His conclusion, published in the peer-reviewed journal Australian Geographer, was unequivocal. Aboriginal oral traditions had preserved accurate geographic data for at least 7,000 years, possibly more than 10,000. Think about what that means. 10,000 years of accurate geographic information, maintained without writing, without printing, without digital storage, maintained through song. Here's how it works. Imagine sitting beside a fire in the Australian outback. The stars above are so dense they look like scattered flour on dark cloth. The air is warm and dry, carrying the scent of eucalyptus and red earth. The fire crackles softly, and an elder is singing. The song is a songline, one of the oldest information technologies on Earth. And it works like this. The melody maps the terrain. Each rise and fall in the tune corresponds to a rise and fall in the landscape. The lyrics encode species, which animals live where, which plants grow in which season, where water can be found in drought. The rhythm marks distances 3 beats between this waterhole and the next, 5 beats from the river bend to the sacred rock. But the songline doesn't just carry geographic data. It carries astronomical data, seasonal data, ecological data, the positions of stars at different times of year, the timing of animal migrations, the behavior of tides, all encoded in a format that can be memorized, sung, and passed from one person to another without a single written word. And here's the part that cognitive scientists find extraordinary. The encoding isn't random. Aboriginal songlines use the same mnemonic principles that memory palace techniques exploit, tying abstract information to specific physical locations, creating a web of spatial and narrative associations that makes the data almost impossible to forget. Initiation ceremonies function as data transfer protocols. A young person doesn't just learn a song, they walk the songline, physically traveling the route while singing the corresponding section. The landscape itself becomes the textbook. The melody becomes the index. The ceremony becomes the download. Lynn Kelly, in her 2016 book The Memory Code, argues that these systems represent the most sophisticated non-literate information technology ever developed. And the data they preserved about coastlines, about catastrophes, about the sky remained accurate for millennia. Now travel across the Pacific, to the island of Satawal, a tiny coral atoll in the Caroline Islands of Micronesia. In the 1970s, a man named Mau Pialug held a body of knowledge that was about to vanish from the earth. Pialug was the last traditional navigator of Satawal. He could read the ocean the way you read a book, the colour of the water, the pattern of the swells, the behaviour of birds, the positions of stars. He could navigate thousands of miles of open ocean without a compass, without a chart, without any instrument at all, using only knowledge passed down through oral tradition across countless generations. In 1976, a Hawaiian navigator named Nainoa Thompson sought Pialug out and asked to learn. Pialug agreed, and together they helped launch the Hokulea, a traditional Polynesian double-hulled canoe. It would eventually cover more than 60,000 nautical miles across the Pacific, all navigated using ancestral knowledge, all guided by the same stars that ancient catastrophe watchers had tracked from their stone observatories. Here's the thing about what Pialug carried. It wasn't just navigation technique, it was proof. Oral knowledge systems passed from master to student, generation after generation, without writing, could preserve complex, precise life or death information across centuries. And then there are the Hopi. In 1948, a group of Hopi elders travelled to the United Nations headquarters in New York City. They had a message they considered urgent, not historically interesting, not culturally significant, urgent. According to Hopi tradition, the present world is the fourth world. The 3 previous worlds were destroyed by fire, by ice, by flood, because humanity forgot its original instructions. The elders came to the United Nations because they believed the signs of the fourth world's approaching end were becoming visible. They weren't speaking about ancient history. They were speaking about the present. Frank Waters documented their cosmology in his 1963 Book of the Hopi. The elders described specific signs Environmental degradation, loss of sacred knowledge, disconnection from the natural world that would signal the transition. They weren't predicting the future. They were reading the same cycle their ancestors had read for thousands of years. Here's what makes the Hopi keepers different from museum exhibits and academic papers. They don't preserve catastrophe memory as history. They preserve it as warning. Active, present tense, directed at the living. The chain of transmission isn't broken, it's functioning. Right now, in real time. And right now, in a way, you're part of that chain. You're listening. You're remembering. Tonight, from 60 countries and more, people are gathered around the same story. Not around a physical fire, but around something that serves the same purpose. A voice in the dark, telling the oldest story humanity knows. The world ended, someone survived, and they made sure we would remember. For 12,000 years, the keepers of this memory had no printing press, no internet, no recording technology. They had melody and rhythm and the stubborn, beautiful insistence that some knowledge is too important to let die. And somehow, against every statistical probability, across ice ages and wars and the rise and fall of civilizations, the memory survived. And now, quietly, modern science is beginning to confirm what the songs have been saying all along. Modern science likes clean categories. Data on one side, stories on the other. Evidence that can be measured, weighed, and replicated on one side, oral traditions, myths, and sacred narratives on the other. Here's the thing about those categories. They're starting to collapse. Remember the geologist we met earlier tonight? Patrick Nunn, in his office in Queensland, comparing Aboriginal songlines to seafloor maps. That moment, an academic sitting across from an elder, realizing that 10,000-year-old songs contained accurate geographic data, represents something larger than one study. It represents the emergence of an entirely new scientific discipline, geomythology, the systematic comparison of mythological narratives with physical evidence. And the results are quietly extraordinary. In the 1990s and 2000s, researchers began comparing specific elements of ancient stories with geological, archaeological, and astronomical data. What they found wasn't vague correlation, it was precise alignment. Volcanic deposits matching eruption legends. The ancient Greek story of the destruction of Thera, the eruption that may have inspired the Atlantis legend. It corresponds precisely with archaeological evidence of the Minoan eruption, around 1600 BCE. The dating, the description, the geographic details, they align. Tsunami sediments matching flood stories. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, geological evidence of massive tsunamis matches indigenous oral traditions. Stories of the sea suddenly withdrawing, then returning with devastating force. The most recent event, the 26th of January 1700, is preserved in both geological records and oral tradition, with remarkable consistency. Ice core data matching darkness accounts. The climate disruptions of the Younger Dryas, the sudden reversal we discussed earlier, correspond with the global Age of Darkness stories. The sulfate spikes in Greenland ice cores, the wildfire soot layers, the pollen records showing sudden vegetation collapse, all align with the window described in the myths. Here's the thing about dismissing ancient stories outright. When a geologist can verify flood narratives against seafloor data, when an archaeologist can match tsunami legends with sediment cores, when climate scientists can read ice cores that confirm catastrophes described in myths from 6 continents, then dismissal starts to look less like skepticism and more like a different kind of superstition. The superstition that the only valid knowledge is written knowledge. The superstition that memory without paper is memory without value. And then there's the work that's even more controversial. Austrian geophysicist Alexander Tolman proposed in the 1990s that a comet fragmented and struck multiple locations simultaneously. This would explain why cultures on every continent preserve the same catastrophe: sequence impact, flood, darkness, fire. His analysis of tektite fields, impact craters, and the geological boundary layer suggested a multi-site impact event. Tolman's hypothesis remains debated. Some of his dating methods have been questioned, but the underlying question he raised, whether a single cosmic event could explain the global pattern of catastrophe memory, continues to drive research. And then there's plasma physics. In laboratories around the world, researchers have generated high-energy electrical discharges and documented the shapes they produce. Spirals, branching columns, radiant discs with extending filaments. Shapes that, when compared with ancient petroglyphs from every inhabited continent, show striking similarity. Here's what makes this particular line of research so fascinating and so contentious. If ancient humans witnessed intense atmospheric plasma events triggered by solar activity, comet debris, or the aftermath of a major impact, the shapes they carved into rock wouldn't be symbolic art. They'd be documentary evidence, drawn from observation, not imagination. Now, this interpretation is far from settled science. Many archaeologists consider the petroglyph plasma connection speculative. The similarities could be coincidental spirals, and radiant shapes might simply be natural forms that humans are predisposed to reproduce. The principle of parsimony suggests caution, but here's what's undeniable. The conversation between myth and science is no longer one-directional. For centuries, science told the stories they were wrong. Now, with increasing frequency, science is discovering the stories were right. Consider the scope of what's been validated. Aboriginal oral traditions, confirmed accurate to 10,000 years by geological survey. Pacific Northwest flood narratives, confirmed by tsunami sediment analysis. Younger Dryas catastrophe accounts, supported by nanodiamond and ice core evidence. Sea level memory, confirmed by marine geology across multiple continents. 300 generations of human memory, preserved through song and ceremony and sacred narrative. And modern science is only now catching up to what the keepers already knew. Here's the thing about that realization. It doesn't just change how we understand the past, it changes how we understand knowledge itself. Because if oral traditions can maintain accurate data for 10,000 years, if the songlines of Australia outperformed writing by millennia, then something fundamental needs to change. The hierarchy that places written knowledge above oral knowledge, scientific data above sacred narrative, it isn't just wrong, it's dangerously incomplete. The comfortable assumption most of us carry through daily life is that the sky is empty, peaceful, predictable. The moon rises, the sun sets, the stars wheel overhead in their familiar patterns. Nothing up there is trying to end the world. Here's the thing about that assumption. It's wrong. The Tauride meteor stream, a diffuse river of cosmic debris that Earth passes through twice each year, may conceal objects kilometers in diameter. These fragments follow long, elliptical orbits. Some researchers believe they include remnants of the same comet or asteroid that triggered the Younger Dryas event, roughly 12,800 years ago. We don't know exactly what's hiding in the Tauride stream. We don't have the detection capability to find out. Most near-Earth objects that size can't be reliably tracked with current technology, and the ones we do find often arrive unannounced. On the 15th of February 2013, a 20-meter rock, roughly the size of a house, entered Earth's atmosphere above Chelyabinsk, Russia, traveling at approximately 40,000 miles per hour. No one saw it coming. No detection system flagged it. No warning was issued. It exploded in the atmosphere, with the energy of approximately 500 kilotons, roughly 30 times the energy of the Hiroshima weapon. Over 1,000 people were injured. Windows shattered across 6 Russian cities. A 20-meter rock, undetected. Energy equivalent to a small nuclear weapon. Scale that up tenfold. A 200-meter object would release energy comparable to multiple thermonuclear weapons. Scale it up 100-fold, well within the range of what the Tauride stream may contain, and you're looking at global climate disruption. Here's the thing about what the ancient skywatchers understood. Their obsessive tracking of celestial movements, the Maya building observatories, the Babylonians recording every planetary shift, the Aboriginal elders encoding stellar positions in song. This wasn't superstition, it wasn't worship, it was vigilance. They were watching because someone had told them, in the strongest language available, through sacred narrative and ceremonial obligation, that the sky had been hostile before and could be hostile again. And we stopped watching. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a scientific framework called uniformitarianism took hold. It's a $10 word for a simple idea that geological change happens gradually, slow erosion, slow uplift, slow drift. Catastrophic events were dismissed as unscientific. For 200 years, the possibility that rapid, devastating events could reshape the planet was considered intellectually disreputable. The irony is extraordinary. The very scientific establishment that dismissed ancient catastrophe traditions as mythology, it also dismissed catastrophism as pseudoscience. Right up until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The asteroid that ended the age of the dinosaurs, the Younger Dryas reversal, the Chelyabinsk airburst. Reality kept contradicting the assumption that the sky was peaceful. Here's what 10,000 years of catastrophe memory teaches us if we're willing to listen. The world breaks. It has broken before. It will break again. Not because of divine punishment, not because of moral failure, because the universe contains objects moving at 40,000 miles per hour, and some of them have our address. And if you're listening to this tonight because sleep won't come, because something in your world feels broken, because the weight of it all feels like too much to carry, here's what the keepers would tell you. The ancient keepers of catastrophe memory weren't the strongest people. They weren't the warriors or the kings. They were the ones who stayed up when everyone else was sleeping. The ones who watched the sky. The ones who asked questions that didn't have easy answers. The ones who refused to let important things be forgotten. People like you. The ancient keepers didn't have YouTube. They had campfires and starlight and the stubborn conviction that memory matters. And somehow, through ice ages and civilizations rising and falling, and everything in between, the memory survived, because someone always stayed up late enough to carry it forward. The sky we think of as peaceful is busier and less predictable than we're comfortable admitting. But we've been warned. For 12,000 years, across every continent, in every language, the warning has been repeated. Watch the sky. This leaves us with one final, uneasy thought. We began tonight with a mystery. Every ancient culture on Earth, cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Cultures that never traded, never communicated, never even knew the other existed. They preserved the memory of the same catastrophes. Flood, darkness, fire. And they preserved that memory with an urgency that suggests it was the most important knowledge they possessed. We explored 3 possible explanations. And now, after travelling across 12,000 years and 6 continents, it's time to weigh them honestly. The first explanation is psychological. We share a nervous system. We share a brain architecture shaped by millions of years of evolution to respond to specific categories of threat. Water, darkness, fire from above. Perhaps catastrophe myths are simply the products of that shared wiring. Universal symbols emerging from universal fears. The flood as the ultimate eraser. Darkness as the loss of all certainty. Fire from the sky as heaven itself turning hostile. There's real merit to this argument. Cognitive science has documented the ways that human brains generate similar symbols across cultures, recurring archetypes that seem hardwired rather than learned. Here's the thing about the psychological explanation. It accounts for the themes. But it doesn't account for the structure. Universal anxiety about floods might explain why many cultures have flood stories. It doesn't explain why those stories independently converge on the same 6-part narrative architecture. Divine warning, chosen survivor, vessel, total destruction, mountaintop, renewal. Shared nervous systems produce shared fears. They don't produce shared plot structures. The second explanation is diffusion. The stories spread. Through ancient migration routes, trade networks, and cultural contact, a single catastrophe narrative slowly diffused across the globe, absorbing local details while retaining its core structure. This explanation has historical support for some regional clusters. Mesopotamian flood traditions almost certainly influenced Hebrew ones. Mediterranean cultures shared shipping lanes and mythology. But diffusion cannot explain Aboriginal Australian traditions that predate the migration routes it requires. It cannot explain Hopi cosmology that shares structural features with Hindu yugas but has zero plausible transmission pathway. It cannot explain why cultures genuinely isolated by geography and time independently arrived at the same narrative architecture. The third explanation is memory. Real events. Global catastrophes that occurred within human memory, the Younger Dryas Impact, the post-Ice Age sea level rise, volcanic winters, cosmic events, encoded in sacred narrative by cultures who understood something essential. Some knowledge is literally a matter of survival. Here's the thing about the memory explanation. It's the one that modern science keeps accidentally confirming. Aboriginal flood songs matching seafloor maps, tsunami legends matching sediment cores, ice core data aligning with darkness accounts, nanodiamond signatures at the Younger Dryas boundary. Each new finding pushes the balance a little further toward memory. The honest answer, the answer that respects both the evidence and the uncertainty, is that the truth likely combines all three. Psychology shapes the symbols. Real disasters provide the raw material. Diffusion spreads and mutates some of the stories. But the structural convergence, the same narrative architecture appearing independently on every inhabited continent, suggests that something happened. Something real, something global, something that burned itself so deeply into human consciousness that 10,000 years of cultural evolution couldn't erase it. And here's what moves me most about that possibility. The people who preserved these memories didn't do it for themselves. They couldn't have. The events they were encoding had already happened. The flood had receded. The sky had cleared. The fire had died. They could have let it go. They could have focused on the present, on survival, on building something new from the wreckage. Instead, they chose to remember. They composed songs. They designed ceremonies. They created initiation rituals that functioned as data transfer protocols. They carved symbols into stone. They wove catastrophe memory into their most sacred narratives and declared it the most important knowledge a community could possess. Not for themselves, for us, for everyone who came after, for 10,000 years of descendants they would never meet, living in a world they could never imagine, facing dangers they could only warn about in the language of gods and serpents and fire from the sky. That commitment, that ancestral act of love, stretching across millennia, is the real story we've been investigating tonight. Not what happened, but who made sure we'd know. And tonight, in a way, you've joined that circle. You've listened. You've travelled across 12,000 years and 6 continents. You've heard the stories that the keepers preserved, the floods, the darkness, the fire, the serpents in the sky, the worlds that ended and began again. You've met some of the people who carry these warnings, the elders who sing coastlines underwater for 10,000 years, the navigators who read the stars with ancestral knowledge, the prophecy keepers who consider their message urgent and current. The comment section wherever you're listening right now, at whatever hour of the night, is a modern campfire. People from 60 countries sharing the same story, in the same darkness, under the same sky. Sit beside the fire, whether it's burning wood or the glow of an electric screen. Let the warmth settle around you. Let the stories do what they've always done, carry you somewhere ancient and quiet and safe. The keepers turned catastrophe into cosmology, disaster into doctrine, memory into music. And somewhere beneath the layers of symbolism and sacred language, a simple, urgent message may still be hiding. It happened before. It can happen again. Watch the sky. But not tonight. Tonight, rest. Let the keepers watch for you. They've been doing it for 12,000 years. They can manage one more night. Wherever you are, Tokyo at sunrise, London in the afternoon, Sao Paulo watching the stars appear, thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Good night.